Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope we all feel energized by, not comatized by lunch. And basically to say, I know this is difficult for a lot of people, it's Khayaat, right? A soft kh. And that's who I am. I'm going to be talking, as the title indicates, I'm going to be talking about social reproduction care. Spoiler alert, a little bit less about climate change because we've had quite an intense introduction to how climate change impacts on the lives of women as well as on social reproduction. But what I'm wanting to do, and it took me a number of days to decide how to approach this presentation. What I'm wanting to do is, as the subtitles say, I want to talk through a number of concepts with you and want to generate discussion and connection with you. And one of the aims for me is also to make connections with previous speakers. They're not always going to be, those connections aren't always going to be that explicit, but I hope that you can see it. But also to making connections to my work with others, with other women, with activists, and so on. And as you can see, for me, the term making connections is quite important. It is important because, excuse me, it's the research title of a project which I'm currently working on at the International School of Social Studies in, in The Hague. And because of this, because of a career starting from 2006 when I first started writing about social reproduction, it is obvious that I had many engagements, I've had many influences, and so on. And for me, it's really a time to make sense, to put things together, what I've learned over the years, but also to make a nod at the connections that I've developed over the years, the women who have been important in my life, and other theorists, right? So you will see my presentation as quite a number of images. Those images were chosen, are used intentionally. So I'd like to also draw your attention to those, and if I forget, please just ask me to talk about it. So I'm taking very seriously what Lynn said in the previous session. Lynn said many things that I agree with around the issue of social reproduction, but what she also said is that we need to take serious the vantage point from which we're speaking, right? So I'm currently speaking or thinking or writing from the vantage point of the ISS in The Hague, where I'm working with two other women who form part of my chair. So you have me, and I'll talk a little bit about my work, and the Marxs Feminism that influenced my work. But we also work with a postdoctoral student, Agustina Solera. She's from Argentina, and Agustina's history doctoral work was with the Mapuche people in Argentina. And then we have a senior academic who's also my host, Wendy Harcourt. Some of you may know Wendy Harcourt. Star, you know Wendy Harcourt, Wendy's work and so on. But anyway, Wendy is first started writing around sexualities, sexual and reproductive health. She eventually, I'm talking as if these are straightforward moves, but she finds herself now in feminist political ecology. And interestingly, what she is doing in this project with, what she's doing in this project is to look at the notion of allyship, right? As a white woman from Australia, where the knowledges and the ways of life of the Aboriginal people have been destroyed. She is reflecting on this in terms of how she engages with my project and my thinking about the South as well as Augustina's. So early in our time together in The Hague, Augustina came across this photograph that somebody sent her, and we thought it was nice to turn this into our sort of logo. Because what it shows is where we all come from, and right in the center, you have the South Pole. Interestingly, Augustina comes from the southern tip of Argentina, that very place where people take the boat to go to the South Pole. So very interesting landscape that she's engaging in there. But what I'm trying to say here, and what I'm trying to work through in this presentation and with you, is what does it mean? I spoke about decolonial theory, I spoke about reproductive health, reproductive and sexual health, I spoke about allyship, feminist political ecology. What does it mean for my concepts that I'm working with? And that's what I want to talk to you about. Emerging out of your conversation this morning, emerging out of a comment that we needed to revisit this concept of social reproduction, I thought, on Crystal's very stern instruction, I thought I'll take a step back and maybe just talk to you a little bit about how I get to this concept, right? So I'm not going to focus on that yet. Just listen to how I got there. So I'm a graduate. Some may even call me a product of the sociology department at Wits University. And one thing you know also of that time is that if you come out of that program, you know your Marx back to front, right? You can quote big tracts of his work, etc., etc. What you maybe do not know is that modules, and at that time, modules or theory on gender, feminism, wasn't all that accessible. So for me it was about the very connections I had to make beyond the classroom, which helped me to develop my feminism. So my understanding of Marx, my acceptance of much of Marx's theory went alongside a discomfort with the gap around women and gender, right? But In addition to all the sort of theoretical tools provided by Marx, Marx provided me and many others with this idea of social reproduction, right? And I'm going to obviously sort of paraphrase Marx. Don't mark me on my precision in terms of quoting Marx. But for Marx, social reproduction was what it takes to deliver the worker to the factory gate. It was as simple as that, right? The education, the nutrition, the clothing, all of those activities that takes, and the worker that he talks about is a very masculine worker, right? We're talking about the reproduction of labor power, etc., and so on. But that was where it, that understanding is essentially where it started for me, right? And for me, it was then a segue into Marxist feminism. Now, there are many different Marxist feminisms, right? Lisa Vogel, for example, talks about a very good book on social reproduction by Lisa Vogel. And she argues that there's two ways out for Marxist feminism, right? Or Marxist feminists. The one is social reproduction theory, and the other one is what she calls a dualistic theory, where you hold gender and class, right? Where you hold it together in terms of your analysis in about social life. So I'm sort of by definition simplifying people's work, so I hope they'll forgive me for it. But those, starting with that original conceptualization of Marx about this whole notion of reproducing labor power wasn't satisfactory, right? We don't produce, invest, etc. in children to create workers. There are all kinds of other relations that go into social reproduction. There are all kinds of other perceptions of this work that I was doing, or this work that we are so interested in. What I forgot to say was that when Marx talks about social reproduction, he doesn't mention women, right? He doesn't mention the fact that women are predominantly, at the time, but still responsible for social reproduction. And if you want to take this further, I do suggest you also pay more attention to the work of Engels around women and social reproduction. But let's just say that, yes, I could see how this is a segue into Marxist feminism. This is how it took me to the notion of social reproduction, which I still feel is a very important form of analysis. But the definitions and descriptions I felt of social reproduction was so bland, right? It was so abstract. It was so wrong or right. It was so obvious that there is this built into these definitions, there is this false dichotomy between production and social reproduction. So there is quite a lot of different conceptualizations of social reproduction. And I think Alessandra did very well in terms of taking us through that. For me, it was also a learning opportunity. And Alessandra mentioned that out of all of those definitions, she likes this definition by, not this exact one, but the way in which Cindy Katz, a social geographer, talks about social reproduction. She likes that best because it does refer to the second half of that first quote there. It does refer to how social reproduction finds itself implicated in a set of economic relations. In other words, this definition does point to the relationship of this concept to an understanding of capitalism, right? But I also like the first part, right? Because the first part points to why people don't like this term, right? It talks about the fleshy, messy, and indeterminate stuff of every day, right? And then it goes on to bland language of structured practices and all of that. But what I want to talk to you about is, and this is also for me a link to what Amrita was talking about. You know, the fleshiness, it's visceral. It's to do with our bodies, right? And we carry it in our bodies. It's got to do with nutrition, yes. It's got to do with exercise and all of this. But it's also got to do with how people view the body and what role the body plays in capitalism. It's messy, right? If anyone has cleaned a baby's bottom or cleaned the bottom of an elderly person who can't do it for themselves, you know how messy this can be. And this messy fleshiness is what can put a lot of people off this topic and want to change our behaviors and our talk about this. And I think here I'll talk later in this presentation about dirt, right? But this fleshy, messy terms always makes me think about a battle around social reproduction, which was called the poo wars, right? Does anyone know about the poo wars? Very sort of sweet and polite term for indicating protests that people in Khayelitsha, a few kilometers from there, you remember Khayelitsha, right, from your time in Stellenbosch? People there engaged in where they literally threw shit at cars driving down the N2. And this whole sort of objection, our disgust with the messiness of this makes us miss out what was important about this battle, right? What do you think was important about this battle? I mean, you're not familiar with the concept, but yeah. Yeah.
And it's not a rhetorical question?
No. Okay. If you had to guess?
If I had to guess, what was the question?
Why would people throw shit at cars?
It's to express their disgust with a system that has probably made their lives shit. Mm-hmm. It's made
but literally shit, right?
Yeah.
Because Khayelitsha is a space where 3,000 people share 10 toilets, right? Think about the messy fleshiness of that. Think about it if you had to use that toilet and you were menstruating, right? Think about it having to use the bathroom late at night, where you have to walk to those bathrooms, they're barely lit, etc., etc. And so for me, this response of disgust and so on, when we talk about the fleshy messiness of everyday life, is an indication about how we miss the important processes underlying this, right? And which actors are implicated in an action like that. And we tend to point the finger at the protesters. But by now we should be able to determine who else are implicated in this thing. But there are also another aspect of social reproduction which I like especially, right? If you look at the work of Fakier and Gill, Shireen, I don't know if you're familiar with them, Toronto people. You see the connections. So Fakier and Gill also talk about social reproduction in terms of daily and generational maintenance and renewal. It is about those everyday things. We have to eat, we have to, what we have to do to maintain ourselves on a daily level. But what I find also still after all of these years fascinating is this pointer towards the future, which is embedded in generational renewal, generational reproduction. Because what this also says is that while we are engaged with the daily grind, with the daily shit and so on, there's a vision of a life that's coming, right? Whether it is our futures as we age, whether it's for our children, whether it's for our children's children, or whether we have children or not, right? It's for a future society. So, and in that notion of a future, one of the topics I'm going to talk about is the notion of hope and whether there is an alternative. Where's Bertha? Whether there is an alternative, and Lynn, is there an alternative, right? I'm taking a specific stance here on social reproduction, and why I'm doing this is to demonstrate to you that in understanding social reproduction, in taking social reproduction seriously, there is a politics involved, right? I think I spoke to some of you who are studying, who are doing your postgrad degrees and so on, and I said, it's essential to have a politics about your research, about how do you bring about, how do you deal with issues of power and control and so on, but what do you envision with this particular research I'm going to? So politics is also, Marx also addresses politics, the politics of the hidden abode, right, when he talks about production, that the workplace is a place of politics, right, which mirrors the world beyond that, to some extent or not. What social reproduction is a hidden abode, right? It's the true hidden abode, because this social reproduction occurs at the level of, it happens in public life, but We're so scared to engage with it. But it is so insidious in our lives that we don't even look at it, right? So, and a little later in this presentation, and I'm taking very long, I'll talk about how Nancy Fraser sees this true hidden abode of reproduction, which was quite a big influence in my work. So, how then do we make this connection with care, right? The concept of care has in itself a long history of theorization. And don't worry, I'm not going to take you through that, right? I thought Alessandra and discussions here on the first day, if you can remember, made that point quite clearly, that care isn't a synonym for social reproduction. It's a part of social reproduction. It may even be an important part of social reproduction, but it's not the same term or the same concept, the same process that we use interchangeably. But care also, for me, provides a certain politics, okay? Forgot to say. Another important book where Cindy Katz was involved, looking at social reproduction from a social geography point of view, looking at race, etc., different parts of the world. Very good source to also engage with. So let's talk about care and politics, or care as politics. And first I want to bring a personal note into the presentation. You know, the other day we talked about care, and when you talk about young children, talk with young children about care, they will tell you caring is sharing. Shireen, caring is sharing, right? Many years ago, I was a timid little PhD student trying to find quite a masculine supervisor, trying to win my way through an understanding of care and so on. And I found myself in Shireen's office, right? Shireen gave me this book called Moral Boundaries, a political argument for an ethics of care. I returned it, or tried to return it, a couple of years later, and Shireen said, no, this is a gift. I want to tell you, Shireen, each and every student of mine have been looking at this particular book, because what you also, some of you spoke about Toronto the other day, remember? First day, spoke about Toronto. And what Toronto talks about is this very often personal, interpersonal activity that it has, that it finds itself, our ethics around, or our ethic of care, goes beyond the very personal, relational aspect of care. That it's actually a public and political good, right? So, a couple of years before that, she wrote with Fisher. Can't remember the first name, Sharina. But I found this definition, or this construction of care, as very useful. There are many. I mean, Guy Standing also has a definition of care where he says it's simply all of those activities, that unpaid work, which goes into physical, emotional, intellectual development of people. I thought this one by Toronto and Fisher is much more useful, right? Because it talks about our world. So it's beyond a sort of understanding of care that happens just between caregiver and care receiver. And in the Moral Boundaries book, which was published in 1998, Tranto talks about 3 different phases of care, which you also mentioned on the first day. Caring about, taking care of, caregiving, and care receiving. In 2013, she talks about a 4th component of care. And I like this because even though in the 1998 book she talks about care as a public good, the interpretation of her work has very much been about care diets, right? Care, this activity which happens between caregiver and care receiver. And with her 4th component of caring with, she talks about it in this book here called Caring Democracy. It becomes much more obvious that care is also what occurs and what we can develop and work on in the public space, right? And this notion of caring with is something that I'm looking at in terms of my work with movements and feminist collectives and so on. But that is very much her intention, right? That she suggests that one of the ways in which we can look at collective work, such as in trade unions, associations, etc., is this notion of caring with. So I took this a little bit further. I tried to, and you'll see at the end of this presentation where I actually end up with this notion of earth care. And I took this notion of earth care, which I hoped was a new way of engaging with the care we do in relation to climate change, right? And there are 2 definitions or conceptualizations of earth care. The one is very intentionally from a Western perspective, so we threw that out. The other day, in Alessandra's presentation as well, she spoke about the work of Stefania Barca. I'm very bad with a Spanish pronunciation. And she talks about the work of making non-human nature fit for human reproduction. So we can see there we have elements of this idea of social reproduction, while also protecting it from exploitation. Yes, I think Bertha will be very happy that we are here protecting what Marx referred to as non-human or nature, right? To secure our conditions for our own generation, right? Quite fitting with our understandings of social reproduction. But I thought, thinking about this, listening to what was happening over the past few days and so on, I thought the term non-human can be quite confusing, contradictory. I think you can go beyond that term, non-human, because when you talk about non-human, non-something, right? We all know this. somebody, where is the person who spoke last night about Steve Biko's idea of black, right? We all know, or we all have some kind of intuitive understanding that if we include the prefix none, we actually elide whatever happens after that, or we actually elide what we are talking about while we're seemingly trying to describe it. But using the term non-human, we still center the notion of human, which has been recently, if you read about the debate around centering humans as opposed to nature, is just a very flawed and divisive way of talking about nature. And instead, it's no surprise. I mean, Jack and I have written together. Jackie, not this book, though. Jackie and I have written together. We've been friends for many years and so on. And I find Jackie's discussion about care and nature actually much more empowering, incisive, and just open. Jackie argues that we are nature, right? It's not, I think, Bertha, I don't know where that quote from you was about, where you said, we are a part of nature, not a part of nature, right? From nature, apart from nature. So this is an idea which I want to expand on when I, just to wake people up, when I get a bit dirty later in this presentation. There's also, of course, other conceptualizations of care. We look, for example, at Shara Razavi's work, where she looks at how, at the institutions of care, when she talks about the care diamond, right? And for her then, there are these four institutions of care: households and families, the market, in other words, that sort of fictitious space where you go and buy childcare or elderly care, not fictitious but sort of imaginary space. The not-for-profit sector, which we talk about, our NGOs and so on, etc., and other forms of support in that area, and the state, right? Now for me, sorry, I can be very literal, right? Diamond has a particular shape. Diamond has a particular character. It's strong. It's indestructible. What makes it indestructible are those very bonds between its corners, right? But what can we say about the care diamond and how it lands in South Africa? And in South Africa, actually, some of those corners are quite missing, right? And Shireen actually talks about it. Shireen actually talks about the fact that when we don't have these functioning institutions, and I think that Ruth, you're going to be talking about, for example, the role of the state in care and so on. But Shireen talks about it and says that when those institutions aren't present, we rely on households and communities, right? And what does that mean? Sounds great. Here we have this community who's ready to help care. No, says Shireen. I'm talking about Shireen all in the third person. No, says Shireen. She says no. It lands on the shoulders of women, right? When those institutions are missing, it will be women who care. And therefore, these institutions, social policy, those policies that determine the existence but also the strength of these institutions are fundamentally gendered. Let me try to be a little bit more exciting about this. And let's talk about love. Are you ready to talk about love? So, when I reflect on the research that I've been doing over the years, right? And I think about interviews and what women had said. Some of you may know the article about outsourcing at WITS, Maria Delamini, who had a massive impact on me. And I forgot to say this. I'll get to this. Okay, who had a massive impact on my life. When I asked her, why did she care for so many people? She said, it's because I love them and they love me. When I spoke, for example, to Lundi Sibanyoni in KwaZulu-Natal and spoke about her abortion, she used the language of love. She said she loves her siblings that she needs to take care of. And the abortion that she had was an act of love, right? When you talk to fisherwomen, and you can look at the writing on the so-called blue economy and so on, when we look at the activities of the women of the feminist table, which I'll talk about later, they all use the term love, right? And we sort of know. We think we know what is love. Of course, feminist economists and sociologists have to complicate this whole thing. That's why Nancy Falbray talks about love as exploitation, right? Certainly when we look at care. And Hochschild and so on in her work also talks about how love in itself under capitalism exploits those notions which we think are, or those characteristics which we think are intrinsic to women. So I wanted to talk about love as a form of solidarity, a form of hope, and something that could influence the politics of care. So I draw on the work of Catherine Russell. There's a bit of publicity for me. Book that I co-edited with colleagues from Sweden, and Catherine Russell's chapter is one of those chapters. There's also an excellent chapter on social reproduction and care by somebody called Rebecca Molinari, which I'd suggest you also look at. But let's focus on Russell. And she talks about love as a moral ethic. What I also like about love, not romantic love. I think sometimes with romantic love we're foolishly hopeful that things will change. But this kind of love, solidarity love, I feel also has this intention around the future, right? It has a hope that there is a future, and that if we infuse that love, solidarity love, love as a resistance, with a recognition that the world isn't as it should be, right? For most of us, the world isn't as it should be, that we would be able to also generate the hope that we can change that future. And I'm being quite superficial here, but my UWC colleagues, Vivian Bozalek, Ronald Karolison is now at Stellenbosch University. I can't remember what Leibowitz's first name is, but certainly in relation to the universities, to the unequal system in the universities, the lack of reproduction of black academic scholars in universities, they tell us we need to hold on to critical hope, right? Where we have this critique of this world and how it came to be in this way, alongside the hope that things can be a little bit better in the future, right? So, thus far I haven't really, I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about an understanding of women in nature. And my good friend Bertha spoke about climate change, and she spoke about the green and the blue economy, and she spoke about her distrust in the state. Bertha, I'm sorry to say that the green and the blue economy is really strongly structured by the state. And if you look at Jackie's work, right, Jackie talks about how this notion of a green economy, where we're going to have green, decent jobs, we're all going to have solar panels, we are going to have a sort of wind generators in our front garden, and so on. Jackie's obviously, sorry, I'm being quite facetious, but what Jackie's saying is that here's another frontier for making profits, right? That the green economy has been captured. And equally so, my work with Natasha Solari around the blue economy, similar. The blue economy operated under a particular program called Pakisa, right? Yes. The blue economy basically engages with water, every sort of, so it's the ocean, right? But also lakes, and so it's fishing, it's offshore mining, it's, right? So you can start to see the competing interest here, or the interest competing with women's engagement already, if we expand that, or we start talking about what the blue economy is. And Pakisa translate to hurry up, right? And if you take the term hurry up and you look at the policy, it was really a rushed policy, totally ignoring women, totally ignoring the activities of women within the blue economy, which has gone on for generations, right? Not just in South Africa, right across the globe. I think we had a discussion about this a few days ago. So and Jackie talks about the green economy or green decent work as decent jobs. We should think about it differently. We should rather think about it as climate change jobs, and that is the issue. Not the development of a sector of the economy, right? But how do we improve the lives of people working on the land, working at sea, and so on, as well as their reproductive work. We need to look also about women and nature, and I did some research a couple of years ago at a place called Luandle in Cape Town, which used to be a place where so-called migrants from other parts of South Africa, where they resided in these migrant hostels, under terrible conditions, and this particular community, the migrant hostels, were transformed right into housing. And what this meant, this place is about 50 kilometers from where I live, and what it meant was that when the housing was transformed here, the Western Cape government embarked on what was at the time the biggest public rollout of solar heater geysers, right? As it turns out, I mean, within a couple of months, none of those things were working, right? And this need for people to have warm water or hot water, where they actually did a community consultation before the installation of these houses, and the people asked for dignified bathrooms. Instead, what they got was solar geysers and a bathroom they share with their neighbors. So one household bathroom, another household, right? No privacy, queues in the morning when people have to go to school, blah, blah, blah. And despite the fact that people said our first sorry, what's the word? The first thing that we want, is livelihoods, the opportunity to get an income. They give the people solar geysers in a move which is as cynical as what Wendy Anneke calls or terms the rich get richer and the poor get renewable energy. And I mean, how also the faulty solar water geysers meant also that people had to then engage in much more environmentally destructive activities to heat their water, internal pollution through paraffin and so on. I'll take it now. And then, and they didn't get what they want in the end. And then women, black people, women, the role, of course, of now an intensified process of heating water for cleaning and for washing and bathing now falls on the shoulders of women, right? Dropping off a child, going to work, taking the same route back, not being able to afford, living in this new neighborhood, not being able to afford electricity or anything like that, gathering wood, etc. She's a woman who needs renewable energy because she's the waster of energy compared to the man, white man, sitting in his beautiful Volvo, right, hooting at the taxi. The damn taxi won't get out of my way. I need to get to work. How dare he be here in my way? Man alone, chugging up the carbon miles on his way home, on his way to work and back. Probably not a Volvo, most probably a Fortuner or something like that. But the woman needs renewable energy. The black woman needs renewable energy, right? So implicated in this, I'm going to come to your point now, is this notion of race, right? Yes, there is class. Social reproduction. Read Jackie's article with Meg Luxton on the unhappy marriage between Marxism and feminism. Read that article. There's certainly social reproduction is certainly an important way of engaging with class. But in South Africa, we have to look at the assumptions around race, right? We talk about it in that chapter on the blue economy, where a colored woman so-called colored woman on the beach. See, by sheer virtue of the fact that she is colored, she is accused of poaching, right? And this is common, right, with all the terrible names that goes with it. But also if we look at the geographical spread of homes, of households, of township versus suburb, and so on, it's clearly racialized. Who lives on the old mine dumps, right? Who lives closest to the factories that spews all of this pollution, and so on? If we look at it simplistically, then we can say it's people from a particular race. But if we combine it with social reproduction analysis in the way that Alessandra spoke to us, then we can do a study on race and social reproduction analysis, which is actually much more about what's happening in the world. So I'm going to skip over the next slide because I wanted to talk to you about situated knowledge and careful research and so on, but we can talk about that in relation to ways of workshopping. I'd rather get dirty with you, right? So here we're looking at the work of Maria Puig de Palacasa. Please excuse my Italian, right, or non-existent Italian. And it sort of has a leap, or a link with the previous slide about how to conduct careful research. When she talks about and engages with the work of Donna Haraway, which will take us a week to discuss, but she engages with the work of Donna Haraway's idea of situated knowledge, and she says that to do this kind of analysis, we have to be grounded in the specificity of those circumstances that can lead to care ethics, right? That can take our care ethics to a politics and an obligation between people. And essentially what she's saying is what Jackie and I said earlier about climate change and so on, that when we engage with nature, we take a materialist position, right? We look at the inequality of the material conditions which can bring about social reproduction and develop our analysis from that. What Maria Puig de Palacasa adds is this affective component, which she suggests opens up an opportunity for us to study what is nature, who cares, and how do they care. And she turns her eye then to soil, right? Wrote quite a bit about soil, but this book by her is quite fascinating, right? She turns her gaze to soil and she says, soil is merely dirt. If we ignore the fact that soil is fundamentally involved in nurturing us and nurturing that which springs from the soil to feed our basic needs. And I find this much more in tune with the understandings that Jackie brings to the table about we are nature, right? That we are not separate from soil, that we are linked to soil in this relationship of care, and that we have to recognize that nature cares for us right? Nature is both us, but it is also caring. And that if we have that understanding, then we will realize that it is incumbent on us to develop a politics around nature. Because its destruction is the very destruction of ourselves and the world we know it, as we know it. What I wanted to talk about next is just keeping all of these ideas at the back of my head, of our heads, talk a little bit about some work I did also with my good friend Jackie Koch, starting in 2012, right? This was a particular moment in time. Why? End of 2012. What happened in August? Marikana, right? 2012. Marikana. Yeah? Okay, so I've got my years wrong. Do a quick Google for us there. 2012. This happened in 2012. It was a particular moment. You know, it was a particular moment where for many people with Marikana, the violence at Marikana, the shooting on people protesting against our dear president, the company he is still involved in, when it was a particular moment where our post-apartheid dream died. For some people it had died way before and so on, but it was a particular point in time, and I know it's 2012 because there's an excellent article which won an award in the Review of African Political Economy around social reproduction, mining, and what was happening at Marikana. Was it 2012 that article won an award? It's a fascinating article by Asanda Benya, right? Hear it, read it. It's, sorry? Yeah, we can all think about connections here. So, and I mentioned this, firstly because this is a fascinating article, but from a certain period in time in the life of the feminist table, which is something that Jackie and I started, Asanda also became part of this, organizing this, and so on. And another significant woman figure in our life. The role of women at Marikana after the shooting was quite significant, right? These are women engaged in social reproduction around these mining communities, quite a masculinist workplace, right? And how important their social reproductive activities was at the time. So this is the context in which Jackie and I get funding and start talking to movements. And these movements were very, very direct about us not drawing in NGOs, us not making these interactions academic heavy. We were also sensitive to that because we were a little bit tired of preaching to the converted, right? So and here I want to show you how ideas sort of crystallize after the fact, right? So here we have Nancy Fraser in 2014, right? And for us, we felt what she was saying was so spot on with what we were doing. She talks about the hidden abode of care, politics, and the environment, which for her captures what the potential is of social reproduction, right? So this is the politics that, or the understanding, the ethic of care with which the feminist table happened. Let me tell you a little bit about the feminist table, and don't worry, I'm gonna skip a few slides. So the feminist table, you can read more about it in that 2018 article of Jackie, that Jackie and I wrote. It was about bringing together all these women from many different organizations. Some of them were COSATU-aligned trade unions, some women. Then from mining affected areas, I think we had a conversation about Wamua earlier, women from Woolman, and so on. Sakau, which is a non-aligned trade union working with farm workers, and other rural workers, movements and assemblies. And what we had there, we can talk about it some other time. It's on the slides, you can read through it. We had what we called quite a thought out, dialogic way of engaging in the feminist table. We have a conversation about what the term table means. And ironically, in all our feminist table gatherings, we never use tables, right? We would use a room like this and sit all around so we could look at each other and be on the same level. So one of the organizations which also, or one of the movements which also attended the feminist table regularly through its different subsidiaries is the Rural Women's Assembly, right? This, also otherwise known as RUA. Do you know this, Crystal? You know about RUA? Yeah, Moshe Andrews. Okay, yeah, Moshe and colleagues, right? So, Rural Women's Assembly, I think, quite an interesting movement of women to study and work with today. They are, have a look at this article I've got here. Here you can see, in these images, you can see what are those things that women think are important in their activism around agricultural work, access to land, and so on. So, women hold up more than the sky. Does anyone know where that comes from? Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong famously said that women hold up half the sky. And what the Rural Women's Assembly say is no, we actually hold up more than half the sky, right? And you can see that in their work. They also talk about being the guardians of land, life, seeds, and love, right? And I think it's important to look at this term, guardians, right? Because I want to talk, and 3 little slides, just about what came out of my work, Jackie's work, and their work, right? In combination is this whole, if one takes the notion of guardianship, one takes the notion of the commons, and you take the notion of land ownership, right? And one is really sensitive to the nuances of all of those, then one can see how, I'm not going to go through the whole slide, but the point I'm wanting to make here, or the question I want to ask you, me, people in this room, is that if our conception of our relationship to the land is as guardians, if it is less about the ownership of private property, which is so intrinsic to capitalism, but it's more about the communal value that we get from the land, can we see the land reform debates, which operates very much on the currency of ownership, can we see that as a recommodification of what people see as the commons, right? And can we return? Are there those possibilities? Is it possible, Lynn, for a return to the commons, for a return of the land and our conceptualization of our relationship to the land to include a feminist commons? So, okay, that's the one question I'm still working through. The other one is about the technologies of social reproduction. We spoke about this. Am I right, Bertha? We see these so-called technologies of social reproduction playing itself out here through the work of women on the land, of collectivizing seeds, of seed sharing rather than seed banking, right? But we've got to think again about here, about the commodification of these activities. If one thinks of the role of GMOs, but big corporations like Monsanto and so on, and their involvement in seeds. And one of the things we did at the feminist table is like people brought seeds, right, and exchanged seeds, and saw it as not my seeds or your seeds. These are our seeds, right? Let's share them. Let's revitalize the crops. I'll give you some of my seeds and you'll give me some of yours. And these things happened. How long have they been happening? Generations, right? The same thing, you spoke about this earlier, about how these things become fashionable. Notice the tail eating. You get these restaurants which now talk about, what's that guy, Jan Hendrik, there in France, talking about tongue, eating livers, eating tripe, as if it's this exotic new thing that he discovered, right? In that chapter on the blue economy, you can see how that is part and parcel of the lives of people living in coastal areas, part and parcel of people living on the land. Who was it that said the other night that slaughtering in itself is such a sacrifice, in a sense, such a major event, that throwing away perfectly edible parts of the animal is actually a form of disrespect. Was it you, Andisa? Was it somebody else? Own up to it, right? And so is it with the preservation of foods. I neglected to tell you something, and I'm not going to take up your time much longer, but this particular graphic here, the one on top above the women, that is a graphic representation of a mat that I've had in my offices from Wits to Stellenbosch. That mat was a gift, right? You know those mats. Sort of concentric circles of checkers, ShopRite bags, the blue butcher bags, the black bags that you get wherever. 20 years ago, I was given that bag, that mat, as a present, right? As a gift from one of the women who cleaned on our floor. I still have it, right? It's still in my office in Stellenbosch. I take it everywhere I go. But how is that not a climate change activity, right? 20 years, that mat hasn't degraded at all, made of plastic bags. We have grown up with mothers who fooled us into putting leftover food in the ice cream tin, right? We all know that. We know about, damn, if you're the youngest child, oh my God, it doesn't matter if you have brothers or sisters, you're going to get those clothes, those shoes passed down, and so on. These are the very people that we talk about that needs to be taught about climate change and their impact. But in the same way, we can talk about an extraction or commodification of those technologies. An extraction, I wanted to say, is something that we need to think about also in terms of the way we do research. What happens when we do extractivist mining? We take out something, we take it for ourselves and we sell it for a profit, right? We also destroy the earth. In the same way, an extraction of taking these technologies, commodifying it, has the same kind of extractive impact on the communities where it's practiced. And we need to be careful about our research not being of the same nature. I'm not going to be talking about hydroponics and so on, but just another lesson we can draw from the feminist table, then I'm going to end. And I want you to pay attention to this book, the graphic of this book. The good news is that this book and other books in the series available on Palgrave Macmillan's website, completely open access, right? You can download it. The previous book in this series is on feminist methodologies. I think written by students, PhD students, graduate students, and so on. I think you'll find it incredibly exciting. But what I wanted to say about the last slide is that what we've learned also through not everything that the feminist table did was successful. We had quite intense fallouts around issues of language and ways in which to deal with that. Who are the experts? For example, there was one and maybe Julia and Cheryl, you will understand me better. One particular feminist table meeting we had in Johannesburg, a person came, young woman, was doing a PhD, came and presented about the economy around bread, right? And she came in, did a presentation and left. And our participants said, no, this isn't good enough, right? We don't operate like this. You don't come and extract and leave. You're not the expert here about talking about bread and preach to us and off you go. So those kinds of engagements we had to spell out, negotiate before the time. But also we found increasingly, as we included more and more queer people in our discussions and meetings, we had to disrupt our own thinking, right? We had to disrupt our thinking, our relations to nature, our relations to what are the kinds of sex that is natural and unnatural, our natalist assumptions that women give birth, everyone wants a child, blah, blah, blah. We had to let go of those ideas and rather focus on the fruitfulness of disrupting the ways in which we think. And those disruptions can come from areas like queer theory, First Nations theory, and decolonial theory, and so on. So you can see how shifting from that original position that a feminist reproductive stance to climate change is essentially about those materialist conditions, and how that relates to capitalism has to develop, right? Because this is the way in which society changes, and this is what we can learn also from younger participants, younger feminists, which eventually joined the feminist table. So I'm still thinking through these ideas. A lot of these ideas knock up against people, the concepts held by people who I'm working with, and so on, and that's liquor, right? It sharpens your own position, it knocks you on the head a bit, rethink what you're doing, and so on. But this is still open, right? I'm going to stop there. Thanks everyone for being so patient with me.